Welcome to Purpose of Heart, the podcast, where real stories meet God's promises. I'm Priscilla Allman, and every week we dive into powerful conversations about purpose in the pressure through caregiving, illness, grief, addiction, and more. If you've ever asked, God, where are you in this? You're in the right place. Be sure to follow the show, and let's find purpose together. Welcome back to Purpose of Heart, the podcast. I'm your host, Priscilla Allman, and today we're going to speak about a very simple message, but something that every heart needs to hear. You are precious to God. In Matthew 10:31, Jesus says, "Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows." Now, that might sound poetic, but it's also profoundly personal. Because in that one sentence, Jesus is saying, you matter to me. Even when you feel unseen, overlooked, or small, heaven sees you as valuable. So let's lean in together, because maybe what your soul needs most today isn't doing more proving, but simply remembering that you are already loved, already noticed, already held. Jesus spoke these words to his disciples at a time when they were anxious and afraid. They were being sent out into a world that wouldn't always receive them. And his comfort wasn't complicated. It was rooted in God's care for creation. He said earlier in that same passage, "Are not two sparrows sold for a copper coin? And not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will." Matthew 10:29. In other words, God notices the smallest bird, the quietest detail, the simplest moment. If he sees the sparrow fall, how much more does he see you? If he cares for a bird that costs less than a penny, how much more is he attentive to the one he created in his own image? Think about that. You're not random. You're not forgotten. You are intentionally and intricately known. Your creation was intentional. Sit with that for a moment. Psalm 139 reminds us that he knit us together in our mother's womb. Every cell, every thought, every gift, all carefully designed. That means before you even took your first breath, God said, "This one is precious to me." Let's be honest. Life has a way of making us forget about that truth. We live in a world that measures worth by achievement, appearance, and approval. And if we're not careful, we'll start to believe that our value rises and falls with productivity. But here's the reality. Your worth was settled at the cross. Romans 5:8 says, "But God demonstrates his own love towards us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Not when we get it all together, not when we're at our best, but while we were still broken, God said, "You're worth dying for." So when the guilt whispers, "You should have done more," or comparison says, "You don't measure up," answer back with truth. I am valuable because I belong to God. Your value isn't fragile. It doesn't fluctuate like the markets. It's eternal because it's anchored in the heart of the one who made you. Let's take this deeper, right? If God says you're precious, right, the question becomes, do you live like you believe it? Sometimes we treat ourselves like we're disposable, always last on the list, always pouring out without being filled. But friend, your soul matters too. Jesus often withdrew to rest, to pray, to recharge. And that's a pattern that we should continue. It's not selfish, it's stewardship. Maybe for you, believing you're precious looks like setting boundaries and saying no without guilt. Maybe it looks like forgiving yourself for what you can't change. Maybe it's letting God's voice be louder than your inner critic. Now, this is my favorite verse. Isaiah 43:4 says it so beautifully. Since you are precious in my sight, you have been honored, and I have loved you. I remember when I first heard the verse, I was just reading my Bible as a teenager, and I was like, oh, this is just sounds like such a nice, verse, like such nice words to say to somebody. But at that point, I didn't really let the words sink down into my heart as they should have, right? Since you were precious in my sight, you have been honored and I have loved you. And there's more to the verse, but it also says you are precious not for what you could give, but simply because we're his, right? Like, let that truth sink in. Let it sit and settle where insecurity once sat. You're deeply loved, not because you earned it, but because God decided it. And no matter what your life looks like on the outside, what your family situation is like, what any of your relationships looks like, when you know the Lord, when you're his, you are precious, you are honored, and you are loved by an all-knowing, all-loving, and faithful God. And when you sort of sit with that thought and let it sink in a little bit lower like it should change the way you live. It should help to stop striving for validation and start walking in confidence. You stop living from fear and start living from rest. Stop shrinking to fit in and start shining to glorify him. Matthew 10 wasn't just about comfort or nice words. It was about courage. Jesus was preparing his followers to face hard things, and he wanted them to go knowing this: you are loved and you are valued, so you can walk boldly. Because if I care about the sparrow, that you know I care about you. When you know your worth in God's eyes, fear loses its grip. You realize if God cares enough to count the sparrows, that surely He cares for me enough to preserve me, guide me, care for me. Maybe today you need to remind yourself that God has not forgotten about you. He hasn't abandoned you, and He delights in you, even here, even now. That truth builds resilience. It helps you to rise after disappointment, love after loss, and hope again after heartbreak. Because the same God who watches the sparrow watches over you. As we close, take a moment to breathe in this truth. You are seen, you are loved, and you are precious to God. You matter to God, you matter to this world, and your story and your presence is part of His beautiful plan. Until next time, keep walking in purpose of heart, knowing that you are valued and that you are loved because you are His. Until next time, friends, bye. Thanks for listening to Purpose of Heart, the podcast, at www.purposeofheartpodcast.com. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. There's so much more God is doing, and I don't want you to miss a thing. Thank you in advance for the reviews and shares. They help this message reach more hearts. I can't wait to walk with you again in next week's episode. See you there.